The wind coming off the Massachusetts coast carried the bitter sting of early winter. It whipped through the ancient oak trees of Hawthorne Academy, tearing the last dead leaves from their branches. The campus was a fortress of red brick and creeping ivy, a monument to old money and untouchable privilege. To the outside world, it was an incubator for future senators, titans of industry, and men who shaped the nation. But to 17-year-old Maeve Gallagher, it was a hunting ground. She stood before the wrought iron gates, her cheap canvas duffel bag heavy in her calloused hand. She wore a faded gray cardigan and scuffed boots, the perfect picture of a charity case. A scholarship student from a broken home, desperate for a crumb of the elite life. That was the story typed on her admissions file. That was the lie she wore like armor. Beneath the oversized sweater, her posture was rigid, forged by years of tactical training at Quantico. Beneath the quiet, downcast eyes was the mind of a federal agent, cold, calculating, and consumed by a singular purpose. 3 girls had vanished from these hallowed halls in the past 6 months. Genevieve, Rosalind, Beatrice. 3 girls who looked just like Maeve. Quiet, unconnected, poor. They were the ones nobody would miss. The ones the academy could easily write off as runaways, unable to handle the academic pressure. The local police had taken the reports, filed the paperwork, and let the dust settle. But Maeve knew the truth. She knew the darkness that festered behind the manicured lawns and the stained glass windows of the campus chapel. She knew because 2 years ago, the exact same darkness had swallowed her older sister, Eleanor. Eleanor, with her bright smile and her trusting heart, taken in the dead of night, never to be seen again. The system had failed Eleanor. Maeve was here to ensure it would not fail Genevieve, Rosalind, and Beatrice. She tightened her grip on the duffel bag and stepped through the gates. The iron jaws of Hawthorne Academy swallowed her whole. The first 2 weeks were a masterclass in endurance. Maeve had to become a ghost, a shadow moving through the grand hallways, absorbing every detail while projecting absolute vulnerability. The social hierarchy of Hawthorne was primitive, brutal, and undisputed. At the absolute summit sat Alistair Sterling, 18 years old with sharp features, tailored wool suits, and a smile that never quite reached his cold, dead eyes. He was the heir to the Sterling Empire, a dynasty built on shipping, logistics, and real estate, but whispered to be rooted in blood and bone. His father, Reginald Sterling, was a ghost in the financial world, a man whose legitimate businesses provided the perfect labyrinth for an international human trafficking syndicate. Alistair ruled the school with a casual cruelty that made Maeve's blood run cold. He was the scout, the collector, the one who identified the weak from the herd. It did not take long for his gaze to fall upon her. It happened on a Tuesday in the grand dining hall beneath vaulted ceilings and iron chandeliers. The room echoed with the privileged chatter of 400 students. Maeve carried her plastic tray toward a solitary table in the far corner, her eyes fixed firmly on the polished wood floor. A heavy foot shot out from beneath a mahogany table. Maeve saw it coming. Her peripheral vision, trained to track multiple hostile targets in a fraction of a second, registered the movement, the angle, the intent. Her muscle memory screamed at her to sidestep, to trap the ankle, to shatter the joint with a single, precise stomp. Instead, she forced her body to go limp. She allowed the expensive leather shoe to catch her shin. She went down hard. The plastic tray clattered against the stone floor. A glass of iced water shattered, sending sharp shards and freezing liquid across the stones and onto her clothes. The dining hall fell into a suffocating silence. 400 faces turned to watch the spectacle. Alistair Sterling stood up slowly, adjusting the cuffs of his imported shirt. He looked down at her, his expression a mask of aristocratic boredom. "Look at what you did, little mouse." His voice was smooth, cultured, and devoid of human empathy. He did not raise his voice. He didn't have to. The silence in the room belonged to him. Maeve remained on her hands and knees in the puddle of ice water. The cold seeped through her thin jeans, chilling her skin. Her knuckles were white as they pressed against the stone. She focused on her breathing. Inhale for 4 seconds. Hold for 4. Exhale for 4. The tactical rhythm kept the rage locked away in a dark, iron box deep inside her chest. She slowly gathered the broken glass, letting a piece slice a shallow cut across her palm to sell the illusion. A drop of blood mixed with the water. "I am sorry." The words tasted like ash in her mouth. She kept her head bowed, allowing her damp hair to curtain her face. Alistair scoffed, a short, sharp sound of utter disgust. He stepped over her, the sole of his shoe grazing her shoulder. His inner circle of sycophants followed, chuckling like a pack of well-fed hyenas. As they walked away, Maeve did not look up, but her mind was working with terrifying speed. She catalogued the heavy silver ring on Alistair's right index finger, a custom piece. She memorized the distinct gait of his walk, the arrogance in his shoulders, the exact dimensions of his vulnerability. She let the students stare. She let them whisper. She swept up the glass, dumped her ruined lunch, and walked out of the hall with the slow, defeated shuffle of a broken girl. But as soon as the heavy oak doors of the dining hall closed behind her, her posture straightened. The trembling in her hands vanished. The submissive mask melted away, leaving only the hard, unyielding features of a hunter. Alistair Sterling thought he had humiliated a victim. He had no idea he had just given a federal agent the exact psychological profile she needed. He was arrogant, he was careless, and he enjoyed the theater of cruelty. These were fatal flaws, and Maeve would exploit every single one of them. The investigation required absolute discipline. There was no backup team waiting in a van across the street. There were no high-tech earpieces, no digital wiretaps, no hacking algorithms that could magically unlock the secrets of the Sterling family. The Hawthorne campus was a dead zone, heavily guarded by private security and shielded by corporate privacy laws. Reginald Sterling's men swept the grounds weekly for electronic surveillance. Maeve had to rely on the old ways, the methods her instructors had called obsolete, but which she knew were the only things that left no digital footprint. Her dorm room was a cramped, drafty closet in the oldest wing of the girls' dormitory. Every night after curfew, when the sprawling campus descended into a heavy, haunted quiet, the real work began. She sat on the edge of her narrow bed, a small, shielded flashlight clamped between her teeth. In her lap rested a battered leather notebook. Its pages were filled with dense, meticulous handwriting. No names, no locations, only strings of alphanumeric ciphers that looked like advanced calculus to anyone else. It was a code she had developed herself, one that existed only in her mind. She documented everything. The license plates of the delivery trucks that came to the academy kitchens at odd hours, the shift changes of the private security guards, the subtle, panicked looks in the eyes of the scholarship girls when Alistair Sterling entered a room. But the most crucial pieces of evidence were not written. They were captured on film. Hidden beneath a loose floorboard under her bed was an old, fully mechanical Leica camera. It required no batteries. It transmitted no signals. It was a relic of a bygone era, and it was her greatest weapon. For 2 weeks, she had shadowed Alistair in his circle. She had learned the blind spots of the campus security cameras. She moved through the shadows of the old library, the damp stone corridors of the gymnasium, the overgrown paths behind the chapel. She was a phantom, observing, documenting. She had captured photographs of Alistair meeting with men who clearly did not belong on a prep school campus. Men with thick necks, ill-fitting suits, and the restless, predatory eyes of street-level enforcers. She photographed the exchange of thick manila envelopes. She photographed the silver ring on Alistair's finger, the crest of which she finally identified through hours of poring over heraldry books in the town library. It was a serpent coiling around an iron key, the crest of a defunct shipping company bought out by Reginald Sterling 20 years ago. It was the mark of the syndicate. But photographs and ciphers were not enough to bring down an empire. She needed the paper trail. She needed the physical proof of how three living, breathing girls could simply vanish from a prestigious academy without triggering a massive federal investigation. The answer lay with the headmaster. Tobias Vance was a man of impeccable reputation. He possessed a silver mane of hair, a booming theatrical voice, and a wardrobe of tweed suits that smelled faintly of pipe tobacco and old money. He gave passionate speeches about virtue, honor, and the heavy burden of leadership. He was a pillar of the Massachusetts educational community. He was also a monster. Maeve knew this with the cold certainty of a seasoned investigator. The disappearances of Genevieve, Rosalind, and Beatrice had all followed the exact same pattern. A minor disciplinary infraction, a meeting in the headmaster's office, a sudden, unannounced withdrawal from the academy. Vance was the gatekeeper. He was the man who made the paperwork match the lies. The opportunity to prove it came on a Thursday night during the second week. A torrential rainstorm battered the stone walls of Hawthorne, rattling the windows and drowning out all sound. It was the kind of weather that made security guards lazy and kept students huddled in their common rooms. It was perfect. Maeve dressed in dark clothing. She left her dorm room at exactly 2 in the morning, moving with silent, predatory grace. She avoided the main hallways, utilizing a forgotten servants' corridor she had discovered behind a tapestry in the east wing. The air was thick with dust and the smell of ancient dampness. She navigated the darkness by memory, counting her steps. 50 paces straight, a sharp left. 20 paces down a narrow wooden staircase that groaned beneath the heavy weather, but remained silent under her careful footfalls. She emerged into the administrative wing. The heavy mahogany door of the headmaster's office loomed at the end of the corridor, an imposing barrier of wealth and authority. Maeve did not attempt to open it. The main office would be alarmed, wired directly to the local precinct. Vance was corrupt, but he was not stupid. He wouldn't keep the true records where a simple break-in could expose him. Instead, she moved toward a much smaller, unassuming door at the far end of the hall. The door to the basement archives. It was a room meant for forgotten blueprints, tax records from decades past, and old sporting trophies. It was where history went to collect dust. The door was secured by a heavy brass padlock. No electronic keypad, no magnetic strip, just solid, old-fashioned metal. Maeve knelt before it. She withdrew a small leather pouch from her pocket and unrolled it, revealing a set of slim, steel lockpicks. The metal felt cold and familiar against her skin. She closed her eyes, shutting out the visual world, focusing entirely on the tactile sensation in her fingertips. She inserted the tension wrench, applying a microscopic amount of pressure. Then, the rake. She felt for the pins inside the brass cylinder. 1, 2, 3, 4. She manipulated them with the patience of a watchmaker. There was no rush. Panic was the enemy of precision. She breathed in the smell of old floor wax and rain seeping through the stone foundations. A heavy, satisfying click echoed in the quiet hallway. The padlock sprang open. Maeve removed it, set it gently on the floor to avoid any noise, and slipped inside the archive room. She closed the door behind her and flicked on her shielded flashlight. The room was a cavern of forgotten paper. Row upon row of metal filing cabinets stretched into the darkness. Cardboard boxes were stacked to the ceiling, sagging under the weight of decades. The air was thick, suffocating, and smelled of decaying wood pulp and secrets. She moved methodically down the aisles, ignoring the older cabinets. She was looking for recent history. She found a section of filing cabinets pushed into a far corner, partially obscured by a stack of broken wooden chairs. The cabinets were locked, but the locks were cheap, standard-issue desk cylinders. It took her less than 30 seconds to bypass them. She pulled open the heavy metal drawer. The screech of the metal sounded like a scream in the silent room. She froze, listening. Nothing but the relentless drumming of the rain against the small basement windows. She began flipping through the manila folders, student records, disciplinary files, Expulsions. Her fingers stopped. A folder bearing the name Genevieve Carter. Maeve pulled it out and set it on top of the cabinet. She opened it, shining the narrow beam of her flashlight onto the documents. There it was, a transfer request form. It stated that Genevieve's aunt in Oregon had fallen ill, and the girl was withdrawing to return home and provide care. The paperwork was immaculate. It bore the official seal of the academy, but Maeve's eyes, trained to spot the smallest discrepancies in forgery, caught the lies. She pulled a small magnifying glass from her pocket and examined the signature at the bottom of the page. Tobias Vance. The ink was black, the strokes confident, but beneath the signature, just barely visible on the heavy cotton paper, were faint indentations. Someone had traced the signature first, likely using an auto pen machine to perfectly replicate the headmaster's handwriting, allowing plausible deniability. She dug deeper into the drawer. Rosalind Martinez, a disciplinary expulsion for academic dishonesty. Beatrice Hayes, a voluntary withdrawal due to severe homesickness. All three files contain letters of correspondence from supposed family members. Maeve photographed every single page with her Leica. The mechanical click and whir of the film advancing were the only sounds in the room. She examined the supposed letters from the families. She noted the postage marks, or rather, the lack of them. The envelopes inside the files had never been run through a federal postal machine. They had no barcode routing data. They had been hand-delivered, likely printed in this very building, to create a flawless paper trail of grief and departure. Tobias Vance had built a ghost machine. He took the girls, handed them over to Reginald Sterling's men, and then manufactured an entire reality where they had simply walked away of their own free will. Maeve felt a cold, hard knot of pure hatred tighten in her stomach. It was the same anger she felt when she thought of Eleanor. The men who did this were not street thugs in alleyways. They were men in tailored suits, men who sat on school boards, men who went to church on Sundays and smiled at the cameras. They were men who believed that their wealth and status made them untouchable, that they could consume human lives like disposable commodities, and the world would simply look the other way. She finished photographing the documents. She returned the folders to the exact position she had found them, ensuring not a single paper was misaligned. She closed the drawer, locked it, and wiped down the metal with the sleeve of her sweater to remove any trace of her presence. She replaced the padlock on the main door, clicking it shut. As she walked back through the dark corridors of the academy, the rain began to ease. The storm was passing, leaving behind a cold, desolate dampness. Maeve reached her cramped dorm room just as the first gray light of dawn began to bleed into the horizon. She did not sleep. She carefully unloaded the film from the camera and hid it inside a hollowed-out textbook. She sat on the edge of her bed, watching the campus slowly wake up through her narrow window. She had the paper trail. She had the proof of the headmaster's complicity, but paperwork was not enough to stop the machine. A clever lawyer could argue forgery, could claim Vance's signature had been stolen. To bring down the Sterling Empire, she needed to catch them in the act. She needed to find out where the girls were being held before they were shipped out. She needed to force Alistair Sterling to make a mistake. The first phase of the operation was complete. She had mapped the battlefield. She had identified the key players. Now the real war would begin. Maeve stood up, shedding the dark clothing of the night. She pulled the faded gray cardigan over her shoulders. She practiced her posture in the cracked mirror above her small sink. She let her shoulders slump. She practiced the nervous darting of her eyes. She buried the federal agent deep beneath the skin of the frightened scholarship girl. It was Friday, the end of the second week. She picked up her canvas backpack and walked out into the hallway. The bell for the morning assembly echoed through the building, a deep, resonant chime that sounded like a tolling bell. As she walked across the courtyard, she saw him, Alistair Sterling, standing by the stone fountain, holding court. He wore a heavy cashmere coat against the morning chill. his breath pluming in the cold air. He was laughing at something one of his sycophants had said, his head thrown back, completely at ease in his dominion. For a fraction of a second, his eyes met hers across the courtyard. Maeve immediately looked down, breaking eye contact, hugging her books to her chest. She scurried past him, keeping her distance, the perfect portrait of intimidation. She heard him laugh again as she passed, a cruel, hollow sound. Let him laugh, she thought, the cold Massachusetts wind biting at her face. Let him believe he is a god in this little kingdom of brick and ivy. Let him believe the world belongs to men like him and his father. She walked into the heavy oak doors of the main academic building, her footsteps silent against the stone. The snare was set, the bait was in place. All she had to do now was wait for the wolves to come to her. The hours between 10:15 in the morning and 2:45 in the afternoon did not pass. They ground against the bone. They were measured not in minutes, but in the slow mechanical sweep of the second hand on Maeve's diving watch, and the heavy, relentless pounding of the blizzard against the stone walls of Hawthorne Academy. She retreated to the farthest corner of the campus library. It was a cavernous room built in the late 19th century, smelling of binding glue, decaying paper, and damp wool. She found a blind spot in the stacks, a narrow aisle between volumes of forgotten theology and colonial history. She sat on the cold, hardwood floor, her back pressed against the heavy oak shelving. She closed her eyes. The tactical isolation was absolute. In the field, isolation was the enemy. A federal agent relied on the wire, the overwatch, the reassuring hum of a sniper team calling clear sights over an encrypted channel. Without communications, an agent was considered officially dark. The protocol was evasion and extraction. The protocol was to survive. But protocol had not saved Eleanor. Protocol had buried her in a closed casket. Maeve focused on her breathing, box breathing, 4 seconds of intake, 4 seconds held in the deep center of her lungs, 4 seconds of slow release, 4 seconds of emptiness. It slowed her heart rate to a steady, rhythmic 45 beats per minute. It chased the adrenaline out of her bloodstream. Adrenaline was useful for a sprint, but it was poison for a waiting game. Adrenaline made hands shake. It made eyes dart. It made an operator sloppy. She needed to be stone. At 11:30, the heavy oak doors of the library groaned open. Maeve's eyes snapped open, but her body remained perfectly motionless. The heavy tread of work boots echoed across the marble foyer, not the soft soles of students or faculty, the deliberate, heavy steps of men who were paid by the hour to break things. She shifted her angle infinitesimally, peering through a millimeter-wide gap between 2 leather-bound encyclopedias. 2 men in dark, insulated canvas jackets walked past the aisle. They wore no security badges. Their collars were turned up against the chill, and snow melted from their shoulders, dripping onto the pristine floors. The taller of the 2 carried a heavy steel thermos. The other held a thick coil of industrial zip ties loosely in his left hand. Reginald Sterling's men. They were sweeping the building, not for students, but for liabilities. They were establishing the perimeter for the extraction. The tall man stopped at the end of Maeve's aisle. He looked down the dark corridor of books. Maeve held her breath at the bottom of her exhalation. She became part of the oak, part of the dust. She did not blink. A predator detects movement, not shape. The man grunted, took a sip from his thermos, and moved on. The heavy doors swung shut behind them. They were early. The snowstorm was forcing their hand. The roads were freezing over. If they waited until 3 o'clock as scheduled, the heavy transport trucks might not make it down the winding mountain pass to the private airstrip. They were accelerating the timeline. Maeve looked at her watch. 11:45. She had to move. She slipped out of the library, melting into the shadows of the student center. The campus was eerily quiet. Classes were technically still in session, but the approaching blizzard had cast a pall over the academy. Teachers were dismissing students early. The administration was focused on the weather. It was the perfect smokescreen. She navigated the servant corridors, the forgotten arteries of the old buildings that Tobias Vance never bothered to patrol. She moved with the silent, rolling step of a combat tracker, placing the outside edge of her boot down first, rolling her weight inward to prevent the floorboards from creaking. She reached a ventilation grate overlooking the rear loading dock. The air blowing through the iron slats was frigid, biting at her exposed face. She peered through the dust-caked iron. Below, in the gray, swirling snow, an unmarked, heavy-duty utility van was reversing slowly toward the steel doors of the sub-level heating annex. Its tires crunched loudly against the accumulated ice. The exhaust pipe belched thick clouds of white diesel smoke into the freezing air. There were no license plates on the front or the rear bumpers. The windows of the cargo bay were reinforced with blackened steel mesh. It was not a delivery truck. It was a mobile cell. 3 men stood on the loading dock, their shoulders hunched against the biting wind. One of them was Alistair Sterling. He was no longer wearing his expensive cashmere coat. He wore a heavy black parka. The arrogant sneer was gone from his face, replaced by a tight, nervous intensity. He was holding a clipboard, checking his watch every few seconds. He looked over his shoulder toward the main campus, a hunted look in his eyes. Beside him stood a man who made the blood in Maeve's veins turn to ice. He was older, in his early 60s, with silver hair clipped tight to his skull. He wore a long charcoal overcoat that cost more than most men made in a year. He stood perfectly straight, unbothered by the freezing wind. He did not look at the truck. He did not look at the men. He looked straight ahead, his eyes like 2 chips of black flint. Reginald Sterling, the architect, the kingmaker, the man who had likely signed the order that ended Eleanor's life. He had come personally. The severity of the storm, or perhaps the sheer value of this particular shipment, had drawn him out of his corporate fortress in Boston. Maeve's fingers curled around the iron slats of the ventilation grate. The metal dug deeply into her palms. The urge to kick the grate out, to drop the 15 feet to the concrete dock, and to drive her titanium pen through Reginald Sterling's throat was a physical pressure in her skull. It took every ounce of her Quantico conditioning to hold her ground. Vengeance was a messy, personal thing. Justice was a machine. Vengeance would leave Reginald Sterling dead on a loading dock, but it would leave his lieutenants alive to scatter and rebuild. Justice required his public humiliation. Justice required him in handcuffs, stripped of his wealth, dying slowly in a federal penitentiary while the world watched. She forced her hands to relax. She watched. She cataloged. The men did not open the steel doors to the heating annex yet. They were waiting for the signal. They were waiting for the campus to clear. They were waiting for the 2:45 mandatory assembly in the dining hall to begin. Once 400 students and faculty were locked inside the dining hall, listening to the headmaster's speech, the rear quadrant of the campus would be a ghost town. They would have 30 minutes of absolute, uninterrupted privacy to haul Genevieve, Rosalind, and Beatrice from the coal cellar, load them into the back of the van, and vanish into the blinding snow. The logistics were brutally efficient. Maeve backed away from the grate. The timeline had shifted, but the objective remained the same. She had to detonate the bomb in the dining hall, and she had to do it exactly as the assembly began. The clock read 1:15. She began her final reconnaissance of the battlefield. The main dining hall of Hawthorne Academy was a massive cathedral-like structure. It featured towering stained glass windows depicting the founding of Massachusetts, heavy oak tables bolted to the stone floors, and a raised dais at the far end where the headmaster and the senior faculty sat. Maeve entered through the kitchen service doors, nodding silently to the cooking staff who ignored the quiet scholarship girl. She walked into the empty hall. She walked the floor like a sniper walking a ridgeline. She memorized the distances. She noted the acoustics. The vaulted stone ceiling would amplify any sharp noise. A dropped plate sounded like a gunshot. A raised voice would carry to every corner of the room. She analyzed the choke points. There were four main exits, heavy double doors made of solid wood. They opened outward. If a panic started, the crowd would press against the doors, crushing those at the front. It would take local law enforcement at least 10 minutes to clear the bottleneck if they had to breach from the outside. She needed to ensure the local police arrived, but she also needed to ensure she controlled the room until they did. She walked to the center aisle. This was the spine of the hall. This was where the oldest, most powerful student sat, the vanguard, Alastair Sterling's personal court. She stood exactly where Alastair would sit. She looked up at the raised dais where Tobias Vance would stand behind his heavy wooden podium to deliver his weekly lies. She looked down at the stone floor beneath her boots. This was the X. This was where the trap would spring. She reached into her pocket and felt the cold, jagged remains of her destroyed shortwave transmitter. The broken wire, the shattered circuit board, a reminder of her isolation, a reminder of her vulnerability. She let the broken pieces fall from her hand, dropping them into a nearby trash receptacle. She didn't need a radio anymore. She was the signal. At 2 o'clock, the storm intensified. The stained glass windows rattled furiously against their lead casings. The sky outside turned a dark, bruised purple, plunging the dining hall into early twilight. The maintenance staff began lighting the heavy iron chandeliers, casting long, flickering shadows across the empty tables. Maeve retreated to the shadows near the western entrance, settling into a dark alcove beneath a marble bust of a long-dead philanthropist. The waiting resumed. 2:15. The first students began to trickle in. They were quiet, subdued by the oppressive weather and the heavy academic workload of the week. They moved to their assigned tables, opening textbooks, whispering in hushed tones. 2:30. The trickle became a flood. 400 teenagers poured into the hall. The air grew thick with the smell of damp wool coats, expensive perfumes, and nervous energy. The noise level rose to a dull, echoing roar. Maeve watched them from the dark. They were the children of senators, CEOs, and foreign diplomats. They were shielded from the harsh realities of the world by thick walls of money and influence. They had no idea that beneath their feet, 3 girls their own age were sitting in the freezing dark, waiting to be sold. They had no idea that the men who paid for their tuition were the same men who traded in human flesh. Today the shield would break. Today they would see the blood on the money. 2:40. The senior faculty filed in, taking their seats on the raised dais. Tobias Vance entered last. He wore his finest tweed suit. He looked perfectly composed, an elder statesman preparing to address his congregation. He glanced at his gold pocket watch, then nodded imperceptibly toward the back of the hall. Maeve followed his gaze. Standing near the main doors, leaning casually against the stone wall, were 2 of the men Maeve had seen on the loading dock earlier. They had shed their heavy canvas jackets and now wore dark, tailored suits. They looked like private security, but Maeve knew exactly what they were. They were the handlers. They were there to ensure Alastair left the hall quietly once attendance was taken, so he could oversee the final loading. 2:43. Alastair Sterling entered the hall. He moved with an arrogant, rolling swagger, parting the sea of students like a prince returning to his kingdom. His enforcers flanked him, their eyes scanning the crowd with casual aggression. Alastair's gaze swept over the tables. He was looking for her. He was looking for the little mouse he had crushed in the hallway that morning. He wanted to see her cowering. He wanted to see the fear. Maeve stepped out of the shadows. She did not cower. She did not keep her eyes down. She stepped directly into the center aisle, planting her boots firmly on the stone floor. She squared her shoulders. She looked directly at Alastair Sterling across 50 feet of crowded dining hall. She let the mask die. She let the terrified scholarship girl vanish completely, leaving only the cold, unyielding presence of a federal operator. Her eyes were dark, flat, and completely devoid of fear. Alistair stopped dead in his tracks. The swagger vanished. For a fraction of a second, confusion washed over his aristocratic features. He looked at the girl in the faded gray cardigan, and he did not see a victim. He saw a wall. 244. The heavy oak doors of the dining hall slammed shut, sealing the room. The metallic clank of the heavy iron latches dropping into place echoed like a gunshot. The dull roar of the student body immediately died down. 400 faces turned toward the front of the room. The weekly assembly was about to begin. Tobias Vance stepped up to the wooden podium. He adjusted his microphone. He cleared his throat, a booming, theatrical sound that commanded absolute silence. "Good afternoon, Hawthorne." Vance's voice rolled across the hall, rich and deep. "As we weather this storm together, I am reminded of the enduring strength of this institution." Maeve did not look at the headmaster. Her eyes remained locked on Alistair Sterling. She began to walk forward, down the center aisle, directly toward the heir of the Sterling Empire. Her footsteps were slow, deliberate. They beat a steady, rhythmic cadence against the stone floor. Clack, clack, clack. Alistair watched her approach. His jaw tightened. The confusion in his eyes morphed into a sudden, white-hot fury. He felt the shift in the room. He felt the power slipping from his grasp. A charity case was walking toward him, looking him in the eye, and she was not trembling. It was an insult to his bloodline. It was a challenge to his absolute authority. He stepped forward to meet her, closing the distance in the center of the aisle. His 3 heavy-set enforcers moved with him, forming a wall of muscle and expensive tailoring. The students sitting at the center tables fell silent. They watched the collision course with breathless anticipation. No one defied Alistair Sterling. No one. At exactly 2:45, Maeve stopped. She was 3 feet away from Alistair, close enough to smell the stale alcohol on his breath, close enough to see the microscopic tremor of adrenaline in his left eyelid. "You lost your way, Mouse?" Alistair whispered, his voice low, toxic, intended only for her ears. "I told you to keep your head down." He raised his hand. It was a casual, dismissive gesture, designed to humiliate. He intended to slap her across the face. Not a punch, a slap. An open-handed strike meant to put a disobedient animal back in its place. Maeve saw the telegraph. She saw the shift in his hips, the drop of his shoulder, the tension in his forearm. To a trained operator, he was moving underwater. She did not flinch. She did not raise her hands to block. She let the blow land. Crack! The sound of flesh striking flesh echoed violently in the silent, vaulted hall. It interrupted the headmaster's speech mid-sentence. Tobias Vance froze at the podium. 400 students gasped in unison. The impact snapped Maeve's head to the side. The sting was sharp, burning across her left cheekbone. A thin line of blood welled up where his heavy silver ring, the ring bearing the serpent and the key, had grazed her skin. Alistair stood with his hands still raised, a cruel, triumphant sneer twisting his features. He waited for the tears. He waited for her to crumple to the stone floor and beg. Maeve slowly turned her head back. She looked him dead in the eye. She did not touch her bleeding cheek. She did not cry. Instead, she slowly, deliberately raised her left arm and looked at the heavy diving watch on her wrist. The sweeping second hand ticked past the 12, 2:45 and 10 seconds. She lowered her arm. Her voice when she spoke was not a whisper. It was not a shout. It was a cold, perfectly modulated projection that carried to the very back of the hall. "Assault on a federal officer," Maeve stated, the words sharp as broken glass. "Title 18, United States Code, Section 111. That carries a mandatory minimum of 8 years in a maximum security penitentiary." The silence in the dining hall deepened. It became an absolute vacuum. Alistair's sneer faltered. His hand dropped to his side. His eyes darted nervously to his enforcers, then back to the girl in the gray sweater. "What are you talking about?" Alistair stammered, the aristocratic confidence suddenly evaporating from his voice. You're crazy. Maeve reached into the breast pocket of her cardigan. She did not pull out a weapon. She pulled out a small, high-density digital recorder, the one device the Sterling sweeps had never detected because it emitted no signal until it was manually activated. She had worn it pressed against her ribs for 3 weeks. She pressed the playback button. She held it up. Alistair's own voice echoed through the dining hall, the recording crystal clear. I saw you, yesterday, wandering around the old gymnasium, digging through the dumpsters like a rat. Know your place. Keep your head down, or next time, I'll step on your neck. Then came the sound of the crushing plastic, the destruction of federal property. Alistair's face drained of all color. He looked like a man who had just stepped off a cliff and realized there was no ground beneath him. Up on the dais, Headmaster Vance gripped the edges of the wooden podium. His knuckles turned stark white. He looked frantically toward the back doors, where the 2 handlers in the dark suits were suddenly reaching inside their jackets. Destruction of federal evidence, Maeve continued, her voice relentless, hammering the nails into the coffin. Title 18, Section 1519, another 20 years. She reached into her backpack and pulled out a thick stack of glossy photographs. She threw them onto the heavy oak table beside her. They fanned out across the polished wood. Black and white photographs of Tobias Vance's forged withdrawal documents. Photographs of the cash in the wall safe. Photographs of the black ledger with the weights in the red ink. Conspiracy to commit human trafficking, Maeve said, turning her gaze slowly up to the dais, locking eyes with the headmaster. Title 18, Section 1594. That carries a life sentence without the possibility of parole. For every single person in this room who signed the papers, moved the money, or looked the other way. Panic ignited. It was a slow burn at first, a murmur rippling through the terrified students, then escalating rapidly into a frantic, chaotic roar. Chairs scraped violently against the stone floor. "Shut her up!" Alistair screamed, his voice cracking with sheer terror. He lunged forward, throwing a wild, desperate haymaker aimed directly at her jaw. It was a clumsy, untrained strike fueled entirely by panic. Maeve didn't simply block it, she dismantled him. She stepped inside the arc of his punch, slipping beneath his fist. Her left hand shot up, the heel of her palm striking the inside of his bicep, deadening the radial nerve. Before he could react to the numbness shooting down his arm, she pivoted sharply on her heel. She seized his wrist with both hands, twisting it violently against the joint, and applied a textbook police submission hold. She dropped her weight, utilizing the leverage of his own momentum. Alistair Sterling, the untouchable prince of Hawthorne Academy, was thrown effortlessly through the air. He slammed face first onto the unforgiving stone floor with a sickening crunch. The impact drove the breath from his lungs in a sharp, painful hiss. Before he could attempt to scramble away, Maeve drove her knee squarely into the center of his spine, pinning him to the ground with crushing, immovable force. She twisted his arm up behind his back, torquing the shoulder joint just enough to send a bolt of white-hot agony through his nervous system. Alistair screamed. It was not a defiant yell. It was the high-pitched, broken wail of a child who had finally touched a hot stove. "Stay down," Maeve ordered, her voice devoid of emotion. The 3 large enforcers who had flanked Alistair stood frozen. They looked at their leader crying on the floor, then looked at the terrifying efficiency of the girl who had put him there. Their loyalty to the Sterling paycheck vanished in an instant. They backed away, holding their hands up in surrender. At the back of the hall, the 2 handlers in the dark suits drew concealed firearms from their jackets. They realized the operation was blown. They were not looking to fight, they were looking to execute the threat and escape. But Maeve had already lit the fire. The disturbance had reached its peak. 400 students were screaming, running toward the exits, completely ignoring the armed men. It was pure, uncontrollable chaos. And through the heavy stone walls of the dining hall, cutting through the howling blizzard outside, came a sound that Maeve had been waiting for all day, the wail of sirens. Not just one, a chorus of them, deep, heavy sirens of state police cruisers, mixed with the sharp, aggressive blasts of armored tactical vehicles. Director Hayes had been listening to the local emergency frequencies. When a panic alarm was pulled from a prestigious academy during a blizzard, generating hundreds of panicked 911 calls from students with cell phones suddenly unjammed in the chaos, the FBI didn't wait for a radio signal. They breached the gates. The heavy double doors of the dining hall did not just open, they were violently kicked inward, shattering the heavy iron latches. A dozen men clad in heavy black tactical armor flooded into the room. They carried short-barreled rifles equipped with blinding tactical lights that swept through the dim hall. The letters FBI were emblazoned across their heavy Kevlar vests in stark yellow lettering. "Federal agents, nobody move, hands in the air." The voice of the lead tactical operator boomed over a bullhorn, drowning out the screams of the students. The two handlers near the back doors instantly dropped their weapons, falling to their knees and lacing their fingers behind their heads. They were mercenaries, not martyrs. They knew when the war was lost. Up on the dais, Tobias Vance tried to slip to a small side door that led to the kitchen. He didn't make it 3 steps. Two heavily armed agents tackled the headmaster, driving the distinguished educator face first into the wooden floorboards. The metallic click of handcuffs ratcheting shut echoed from the stage. Through the sea of tactical armor, a familiar figure strode down the center aisle. Director Hayes. He wore a heavy wool overcoat over his suit, his face weathered, grim, and etched with the deep lines of a man who had seen too much darkness. He looked down at Alistair Sterling, who was still weeping against the stone floor, his face bruised and covered in dust. Hayes then looked up at Maeve. He took in her torn sweater, the thin line of blood drying on her cheek, and the absolute, unwavering calm in her eyes. "Status, Agent Gallagher?" Hayes asked, his voice rough but carrying an unmistakable undertone of profound respect. Maeve slowly lifted her knee from Alistair's back, allowing an arresting officer to haul the sobbing heir to his feet and secure his wrists in heavy steel cuffs. She stood up straight, smoothing the wrinkles from her faded gray cardigan. She reached into her pocket, retrieved the heavy titanium pen, and clipped it neatly to her collar. "Primary target secured, Director," Maeve reported, her voice steady and professional. "The ledger is on the table. The headmaster is the logistics coordinator." She turned and pointed toward the eastern wall, gesturing through the stained glass windows toward the howling blizzard outside. "The extraction team is waiting at the sub-level heating annex," she continued, her eyes hardening. "Reginald Sterling is on the loading dock, and 3 hostages are locked inside the boiler room: Genevieve, Rosalind, and Beatrice." Director Hayes nodded sharply. He keyed the heavy radio clipped to his vest. "Alpha Team, converge on the heating annex. We have a confirmed location on the hostages. Lethal force authorized if the targets attempt to move the girls. Breach and clear." "Copy that, Command," the radio crackled back. "Moving in." Maeve stood in the center of the shattered dining hall. The students who had once looked right through her, who had treated her like invisible dirt beneath their expensive shoes, now stared at her in stunned, terrified silence. They parted to give her a wide berth. She did not look back at them. She did not gloat. The theatrical performance was over. The job was done. She walked past the heavy oak tables, past the scattered photographs of the ledger, and out through the shattered main doors. The freezing air hit her face, crisp and clean. The blizzard was beginning to break, the heavy gray clouds fracturing to reveal slivers of pale winter sunlight. Down by the loading dock, the unmarked utility van was surrounded by 4 black tactical vehicles. Reginald Sterling, the untouchable kingmaker, was being slammed against the hood of an FBI cruiser, his hands bound tightly behind his back, his aristocratic face pressed into the freezing metal. And from the rusted doors of the old heating annex, medics were escorting three girls wrapped in heavy thermal blankets. They were shivering, blinking against the sudden light, but they were walking on their own. They were alive. Maeve watched them for a long moment. She felt the heavy, suffocating knot of anger that had lived in her chest since the day Eleanor died begin to loosen, just a fraction. It was not peace. It would never be peace, but it was justice. Director Hayes stepped up beside her, lighting a cigarette against the wind. He offered her a grim nod. "Good work, Maeve," he said quietly. "You took off the head." Maeve buttoned her coat against the chill. She watched Reginald Sterling being shoved into the back of a federal transport. "He's just one head, Director," Maeve replied, her eyes fixed on the horizon, already calculating the next move. The ledger showed routing numbers to 6 other academies across the eastern seaboard. 6 more operations just like this one. She turned away from the flashing lights and the sirens, walking toward the black sedan waiting at the edge of the campus gates. "Get the teams ready," she said, her voice swallowed by the wind. "We have a lot of work to do." The echo of the sirens faded into the howling Massachusetts wind, but the campus of Hawthorne Academy remained shattered. The illusion of untouchable prestige lay in ruins across the polished stone floors. Federal agents in heavy Kevlar moved with deliberate, practiced efficiency through the vaulted halls of the dining center. The 400 students who had previously ruled this enclave of wealth were now corralled behind yellow crime scene tape, their faces pale, their designer clothes suddenly looking absurd against the grim reality of a federal raid. Maeve Gallagher stood near the shattered oak doors of the cafeteria. The adrenaline that had carried her through the confrontation with Alistair Sterling was slowly receding, leaving behind a deep, bone-aching exhaustion. Her gray cardigan was torn. The thin cut across her cheekbone, inflicted by Alistair's silver ring, had stopped bleeding, drying into a stark red line against her pale skin. She watched as paramedics wheeled 3 stretchers across the icy courtyard. Genevieve, Rosalind, Beatrice. They were wrapped in heavy foil thermal blankets, their faces hollow and shell-shocked from their time in the freezing dark of the sub-level heating annex. But their eyes were open. They were breathing the cold winter air. They were free. Director Hayes approached her, his heavy wool overcoat dusted with snow. He handed her a steaming cup of black coffee from a tactical thermos. "The perimeter is entirely secure," Hayes said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that cut through the noise of the operation. "State police have locked down the access roads. The transport van at the loading dock is impounded. We have Reginald Sterling, Alistair Sterling, and Tobias Vance in separate transport vehicles. They are being moved to the federal field office in Boston immediately." Maeve took the coffee. The heat seeped into her freezing palms. "The ledger?" she asked, her voice steady. "Bagged and tagged," Hayes confirmed, "along with the mechanical camera film you left in the dorm room. The forensics team is tearing the headmaster's office apart as we speak. They already found the false back in the wall safe. It is a clean sweep, Maeve. You built an ironclad cage, and they walked right into it." Maeve took a slow sip of the bitter coffee. She looked at the flashing red and blue lights reflecting off the ancient brick walls of the academy. "It is not over until the cell doors lock, Director. Reginald Sterling has lawyers on retainer who cost more than this entire operation. He will try to buy his way out of the dark." Hayes offered a grim, knowing smile. "Let him try. He has never been interrogated by the agent who just dismantled his son in front of 400 witnesses." The drive to the Boston field office was silent. Maeve sat in the back of an armored SUV, watching the frozen Massachusetts landscape blur past the reinforced windows. She used the time to systematically catalog the evidence in her mind. She categorized every photograph, every forged signature, every bank routing number she had memorized from Tobias Vance's ledger. An interrogation was not a conversation. It was a surgical procedure. It required precision, patience, and absolute control. They arrived at the federal building just as the winter sun began to set, casting long, bruised shadows across the city skyline. The interrogation rooms were located in the secure basement levels. No windows, no natural light, only the relentless hum of the ventilation system and the harsh glare of fluorescent bulbs. Maeve stripped off the torn gray cardigan, leaving it in the evidence locker. She washed the dried blood from her face in a small stainless steel sink. She put on a dark, tailored suit jacket provided by the field office. When she looked in the mirror, the terrified scholarship girl was completely gone. In her place stood Special Agent Gallagher, cold, immaculate, unyielding. Director Hayes met her in the observation corridor. Behind a wall of one-way glass, Tobias Vance sat at a metal table. The former headmaster of Hawthorne Academy looked small, stripped of his tweed suits in his grand, vaulted office. He was just an aging bureaucrat trembling under the harsh lights. "He has been asking for his attorney," Hayes noted, handing Maeve a thick manila folder containing the forged withdrawal documents. "But the blizzard has shut down the interstate. His legal counsel is stuck in traffic 30 miles outside the city. He is isolated." "Good," Maeve said, taking the folder. "Isolation breeds panic. Let us see how much loyalty the headmaster really has to the Sterling Empire." Maeve opened the heavy steel door and stepped into the interrogation room. The air was stale and cold. Vance looked up, his eyes wide behind his wire-rimmed glasses. When he recognized her, the color completely drained from his face. He remembered the quiet girl in the faded sweater. He remembered the girl who had calmly read federal statutes while breaking Alistair Sterling's arm. Maeve did not introduce herself. She did not offer him a glass of water. She walked to the opposite side of the metal table, dropped the thick manila folder onto the steel surface with a loud, authoritative slap, and sat down. She folded her hands on the table and stared at him. She did not speak. She let the silence stretch. 10 seconds. 20 seconds. The silence was a physical weight, pressing down on the older man's chest. Vance broke first. He shifted uncomfortably in his metal chair, his hands sweating. "This is an outrage," he stammered, attempting to summon his theatrical baritone, but his voice cracked. "I demand to know the meaning of this. I am the headmaster of a prestigious institution. You have no right—" "Tobias Vance," Maeve interrupted. Her voice was flat, devoid of any inflection. It was the voice of a machine reading a sentence. "You are currently facing 3 counts of conspiracy to commit kidnapping, 3 counts of human trafficking, and 1 count of destruction of federal evidence. The mandatory minimum for these charges, served consecutively, is life in a maximum security federal penitentiary without the possibility of parole." Vance swallowed hard. His Adam's apple bobbed nervously. "I have no idea what you are talking about. Those girls withdrew voluntarily. Their families—" Maeve opened the folder. She slid an 8x10 glossy photograph across the table. It was a close-up of the withdrawal document for Genevieve. "This document states Genevieve returned to Oregon to care for her ailing aunt," Maeve said. "We have contacted the authorities in Oregon. Genevieve's aunt died 6 years ago. Furthermore, the postage mark on the envelope is absent, indicating it was never processed by the United States Postal Service. It was printed in your basement archives." Vance stared at the photograph. A bead of sweat rolled down his temple. "A clerical error," he whispered. "The admissions office handles the paperwork. I merely sign off on their recommendations." Maeve slid a second photograph across the table. It was a macro lens shot of his signature on the document, revealing the faint indentations of the auto pen machine beneath the ink. "You used a mechanical auto pen to trace the signature, allowing for plausible deniability," Maeve stated. "A clever trick. But forensics has already seized the machine from your office. The ink matches. The pressure patterns match." She did not give him time to formulate a lie. She immediately slid a third photograph across the metal surface. It was a clear, undeniable image of the black leather ledger, opened to the page detailing the weights and prices of the three girls, cross-referenced with the dates of their disappearances. Item G, 14. Item R, 22. Item B, 09. Maeve read aloud, her eyes locked onto his. You reduced human beings to inventory numbers, Tobias. You sold your own students to Reginald Sterling. You kept the ledger in your wall safe, right next to $60,000 in untraceable currency. Vance's chest began to heave. The walls of the interrogation room were closing in on him. He looked at the photographs, the irrefutable proof of his own monstrous corruption. His hands began to shake violently against the metal table. Reginald Sterling is a powerful man, Vance whispered, his voice dropping to a frantic hiss. He contributes millions to the academy. I had no choice. If I refused, he would have ruined me. He would have destroyed the school. You are not a victim, Mr. Vance, Maeve said, her voice dropping to a dangerous, icy register. You are a facilitator. You built the ghost machine that made those girls disappear, and you will die in a concrete cell for it. She leaned forward, closing the distance between them. Unless you give me the network. Vance looked up, a desperate glimmer of hope in his terrified eyes. The network? Hawthorne Academy is not the only hunting ground, Maeve said. Your ledger contained offshore routing numbers that do not belong to Reginald Sterling. They belong to a wider syndicate. Give me the names of the other headmasters. Give me the locations of the other schools. You cooperate with the federal government right now, and I will personally recommend that you serve your life sentence in a minimum security facility where you can see the sun. You refuse, and I will put you in a supermax block where the only people you speak to for the rest of your life are men who hate child traffickers. Vance broke completely. The aristocratic educator crumbled into a weeping, pathetic show. He reached for the pen resting on the manila folder. I will tell you everything, Vance sobbed, his tears dropping onto the metal table. I will give you the names. Just please, do not let Reginald Sterling get to me. Maeve stood up, buttoning her suit jacket. She looked down at him with absolute contempt. Start writing, Tobias. Director Hayes will be in shortly to take your official statement. She walked out of the room, leaving the broken man to his confessions. In the observation corridor, Director Hayes nodded approvingly. He is singing like a canary. He just named 2 boarding schools in New York and 1 in Pennsylvania. You broke him in under 10 minutes. He is a coward, Maeve replied coldly. Cowards always look for the easiest way to survive. The real test is the Sterling bloodline. Where is the son? Interrogation room 3, Hayes said. A medical team examined him. His shoulder is severely sprained, but not dislocated. He has been screaming for his father for the past hour. Maeve took a deep breath. She thought of the heavy, silver ring on Alistair's hand. The ring that had struck her face. The ring that bore the crest of a syndicate that had swallowed her sister whole. Let me see him, she said. Interrogation room 3 was identical to the first, but the atmosphere inside was entirely different. It was charged with a frantic, toxic energy. Alistair Sterling paced the length of the small room like a caged animal. His expensive black parka was gone. He wore a standard gray Federal holding jumpsuit. His left arm was secured in a medical sling. His face was pale, bruised, and twisted into a mask of pure, arrogant rage. When the heavy steel door opened and Maeve walked in, Alistair stopped pacing. He stared at her, his chest heaving. He expected a team of lawyers. He expected his father's fixers to come and unlock the door. Instead, he got the girl in the gray cardigan. You, Alistair spat, his voice laced with venom. You have no idea what you have done. My father is going to obliterate you. He is going to buy this entire building, fire everyone in it, and bury you in a hole so deep you will never see daylight again. Maeve walked to the table. She did not sit down. She stood, projecting absolute dominance over the confined space. Sit down, Alistair, she commanded. I am not sitting anywhere, he shouted, taking a step toward her. I know my rights. I want my phone. I want my father's attorney. Maeve did not flinch. She simply stared at him, her dark eyes completely empty of fear, empathy, or hesitation. I said, sit down. The sheer weight of her authority, forged in the fires of federal training and hardened by unimaginable personal loss, hit Alistair like a physical blow. He remembered the blinding pain in his shoulder. He remembered the terrifying ease with which she had driven him to the stone floor of the cafeteria. His bravado fractured. He slowly backed away and sank into the metal chair, clutching his injured arm. You are 18 years old, Maeve stated, her voice calm and methodical. You are legally an adult in the eyes of the federal government. You are currently facing charges of assault on a federal officer, destruction of evidence, and conspiracy to commit interstate kidnapping. The fact that your father is a billionaire does not change the statutes of the United States Penal Code. Alistair scoffed, though the sound was weak and unconvincing. You have nothing. A broken radio? A tape recording of me yelling at you? That is bullying, not kidnapping. You cannot prove I had anything to do with those girls in the basement. Maeve reached inside her suit jacket. She withdrew a single photograph. It was not a document. It was a high-resolution, black-and-white image she had taken with her mechanical Leica from the shadows of the old gymnasium. She dropped it onto the table. The photograph showed Alistair standing on the loading dock, handing a thick manila envelope to the two heavily armed handlers. His face was clearly illuminated by the exterior security lights. The silver ring on his finger was perfectly in focus. This was taken 3 days ago, Maeve said. It documents you directly paying the transport crew to move the previous shipment. We have already matched the faces of the two men in this photo to the men we arrested in the cafeteria today. They are career mercenaries, and they are currently in the next room, drafting sworn affidavits stating that you were the primary scout who selected Genevieve, Rosalind, and Beatrice. Alistair stared at the photograph. His arrogant sneer vanished entirely. His breathing became shallow and rapid. The reality of his situation, the cold, unforgiving machinery of the federal justice system, finally pierced through his shield of wealth and privilege. My father, Alistair whispered, his eyes darting frantically around the windowless room. My father told me to do it. He told me it was the family business. He said I had to prove I was strong enough to inherit the empire. I didn't want to hurt anyone. I had to do what he said. Maeve felt a flicker of absolute disgust. It was the same story everywhere, predators creating smaller predators. A legacy of cruelty passed down from father to son. Your father is sitting in a cell at the end of this hallway, Maeve said quietly. He is not coming to save you, Alistair. He is currently instructing his legal team to distance himself from you entirely. He is going to claim you acted alone, that you were a troubled, rogue teenager who organized the kidnappings without his knowledge. Alistair's head snapped up. Betrayal washed over his bruised face. No, he wouldn't do that. I am his son. He is a trafficker, Maeve corrected him. He deals in survival. And to survive, a reptile will gladly sacrifice its own limb. She leaned over the table, bringing her face close to his. You are looking at 25 years, Alistair. You will be 43 years old when you see the outside of a cell. Your youth, your wealth, your entire future, gone. Because you wanted to impress a man who views you as nothing more than a liability. Tears welled in Alistair's eyes. The golden boy of Hawthorne Academy was broken. He buried his face in his good hand, sobbing openly in the sterile interrogation room. What do you want? He wept into his palm. I want the logistics, Maeve said, her voice uncompromising. I want the names of the doctors who supplied the sedatives. I want the flight plans for the private airstrip. I want every single detail of your father's operation. You write it all down, you sign a full confession, and you testify against Reginald Sterling in open court. That is your only way to mitigate the damage. Alistair nodded frantically, not looking up. I'll do it. I'll testify. Just tell the judge I was forced. Maeve stood up. She felt no satisfaction in breaking a boy. He was a monster, but he was a monster built by a greater evil. She turned and walked toward the heavy steel door. "Agent Gallagher," Alistair called out, his voice weak and trembling. Maeve stopped, her hand on the door handle. She did not look back. "Who are you?" he asked. "You were just a charity case. You were nobody." Maeve looked at the cold steel of the door. She thought of the faded gray cardigan sitting in an evidence locker. She thought of the 3 years she had spent in tactical training, bleeding on gym mats, memorizing penal codes, firing thousands of rounds into paper targets, all to prepare for this exact day. "I am the consequence," Maeve said softly. She opened the door and walked out. Director Hayes was waiting in the corridor. He held a thick file folder under his arm. His face was unusually solemn. "Vance confessed. Alistair is cooperating," Maeve reported, her voice tired but steady. "We have the connective tissue. We can tie the kidnappings directly to the Sterling payroll." "Good," Hayes said. He handed her the thick file. "Because the main event is ready." Reginald Sterling's legal counsel finally arrived. 3 corporate defense attorneys in $1,000 suits. They are threatening to file injunctions, civil rights violations, and unlawful detainment suits. They want him released immediately. Maeve took the file. It was heavy. It contained the culmination of her entire investigation. The photographs, the financial records, the witness statements. It was the spear she had forged to pierce the dragon's hide. "Let them threaten," Maeve said, her eyes narrowing. "Lawyers argue technicalities. They cannot argue with a loaded gun." She walked down the long, sterile corridor toward Interrogation Room 1. This was the largest room. He sat with his hands steepled under his chin, projecting an aura of absolute, terrifying calm. He did not look like a man facing life in prison. He looked like a CEO waiting for a board meeting to begin. Flanking him were his 3 attorneys. They immediately stood up as Maeve entered. Agent Gallagher, the lead attorney, a man with silver hair and a sharp, predatory face, said aggressively, "This entire charade is over. My client is a respected businessman and a philanthropist. We have filed an immediate writ of habeas corpus. If he is not released within the hour, we will sue the Federal Bureau of Investigation for malicious prosecution, and we will personally ensure your career is terminated." Maeve did not acknowledge the attorney. She walked to the opposite end of the table and dropped the heavy file down with a resounding thud. She remained standing. She looked directly at Reginald Sterling. His black, flinty eyes met hers. There was no fear in him, only a cold, calculating intellect. "Your son is currently in room 3, drafting a sworn confession detailing your direct involvement in the human trafficking syndicate operating out of Hawthorne Academy," Maeve said. Her voice was steady, cutting through the aggressive posturing of the lawyers. The lead attorney scoffed. "Hearsay, a terrified teenager coerced by federal agents under duress. Any competent judge will throw that out before preliminary hearings." Maeve ignored him. She kept her eyes locked on Reginald. "Tobias Vance has provided us with the offshore routing numbers you used to pay him for the students," Maeve continued, opening the file and sliding a document down the long table. It stopped inches from Reginald's steepled hands. "We have matched those routing numbers to shell companies registered under Sterling Logistics. The money trail is established." Reginald looked down at the document. His expression did not change. He slowly looked back up at Maeve. "A sophisticated frame job," Reginald said, his voice deep, cultured, and devoid of panic. "Corporate espionage is a dirty business, Agent Gallagher. My competitors have tried to fabricate evidence against me before. You have found a corrupt headmaster and a few frightened children. You have nothing that ties me, personally, to any illicit activity. I am insulated." He smiled. It was a terrifying, hollow gesture. "You are young," Reginald continued softly. "You believe in the system, but the system is built by men like me. It is designed to protect men like me. You think you have won because you put handcuffs on me in front of a few cameras. But by tomorrow morning, I will be sitting in my office in Boston, drinking an espresso, and you will be facing an internal affairs review that will end your life in law enforcement. The three attorneys nodded in silent agreement, packing their briefcases. They believed the game was over. Maeve did not move. She let the billionaire's arrogance fill the room. She let him believe he had won. Then she reached into the very back of the file folder. She pulled out a single, aged piece of paper. It was not a glossy photograph or a bank statement. It was a faded, handwritten letter. She held it up. "Do you know what this is, Reginald?" she asked, her voice dropping to a whisper that carried across the quiet room. Reginald's eyes narrowed slightly. He did not recognize the paper. "This is a journal entry," Maeve said, "written 2 years ago by a girl named Eleanor. She was taken from a boarding school in Connecticut. She was held in a shipping container for 3 months before she managed to escape. She documented her captivity. She documented the men who hurt her. And she documented the man who came to inspect the cargo before it was loaded onto the ships." The atmosphere in the room suddenly changed. The absolute calm radiating from Reginald Sterling fractured. A microscopic twitch appeared at the corner of his jaw. "She described a man with silver hair and a charcoal coat," Maeve continued, her voice trembling with barely suppressed emotion. "A man who wore a heavy silver ring on his right hand, a ring depicting a serpent coiled around a key. She drew the crest perfectly in her journal." She slid the aged paper down the table. It came to rest beside the bank statements. "Eleanor did not survive her trauma," Maeve said, a cold, hard tear finally escaping her eye, tracking down her cheek. "She died 6 months after she escaped, but she left behind the map to your entire empire. She left behind the exact dates of the shipments, the descriptions of the holding facilities, and the names of the international buyers." Reginald stared at the journal entry. The handwriting was frantic, desperate, a testament to unimaginable horror. The drawing of the syndicate crest was undeniable. "My sister built this case, Reginald," Maeve whispered, her voice like steel. "I just executed it." The lead attorney looked at the journal entry, then looked at his client. For the first time, doubt crept into the lawyer's eyes. A coerced confession was manageable. A complex financial fraud was defensible. But a handwritten journal from a deceased victim, perfectly matching physical evidence across multiple state lines, was a prosecutor's dream. It was the kind of evidence that secured federal death penalty convictions. Reginald Sterling did not speak. He sat perfectly still, staring at the faded ink of a dead girl. He realized in that moment that all his wealth, all his influence, and all his insulation had failed him. He had been outmaneuvered not by a massive federal agency, but by the ghost of a girl he had discarded as garbage, and the relentless, unstoppable sister she had left behind. "The Department of Justice has authorized a RICO indictment based on this journal and the corroborating evidence we secured today," Maeve stated, closing the file folder. "Your assets are frozen. Your companies are being raided as we speak. There is no bail. There is no release. You will die in a cage, Reginald, and I will make sure you remember my sister's name every single day you sit in the dark." Maeve turned and walked out of the interrogation room. She did not wait to hear the panicked whispers of the attorneys. She did not need to see the billionaire finally break. The machine of justice was in motion, and it would grind him to dust. She walked out of the holding area and took the elevator up to the main floor of the field office. The winter night had fully descended upon Boston. She stood by a large window, looking out over the city lights reflecting off the freezing harbor. The operation was a resounding success. The media would run the story for weeks. The politicians would claim the victory. Genevieve, Rosalind, and Beatrice would sleep in their own beds tonight. The Sterling Empire was dead. But Maeve knew the truth. Director Hayes stepped up beside her. He held a secure, encrypted tablet in his hand. "The raids on the Sterling corporate offices just concluded," Hayes said quietly. "We accessed his primary servers. We broke the encryption on his personal communications network. The Hydra, Maeve said, not looking away from the window. Hayes nodded slowly. Yes, Sterling was not the head of the snake. He was merely a regional coordinator. The network is vast, Maeve. It operates through dozens of elite academies, private country clubs, and corporate retreats across the country. He handed her the tablet. Displayed on the glowing screen was a digital map of the United States. 6 bright red markers glowed ominously across the map. One in Virginia, one in New York, one in California, one in Texas, one in Florida, one in Illinois. 6 other regional hubs, Hayes said, his voice grim. 6 other men just like Reginald Sterling, running their own ghost machines, hunting vulnerable girls in places where no one thinks to look. Maeve stared at the red markers. Each one represented a school. Each one represented a dark basement, a forged document, and a girl who was sitting in the freezing cold, waiting for someone to save her. She thought of Eleanor. She felt the heavy titanium pen clipped to her collar. The exhaustion in her bones evaporated, replaced by a cold, burning resolve. The Sterling Empire had fallen, but the war had only just begun. "Pack a bag, Agent Gallagher," Director Hayes said softly. "You have a flight to catch." Maeve handed the tablet back to him. She buttoned her dark suit jacket. Her eyes were hard, focused, and utterly devoid of fear. "Where are we going, Director?" she asked. "Virginia," Hayes replied. "A prestigious boarding school in the Blue Ridge Mountains. They just reported 2 female scholarship students missing. Runaways, the local police say." Maeve nodded. She understood the assignment. She understood the sacrifice required. She would have to become the ghost again. She would have to walk back into the darkness, put on the mask of the victim, and wait for the wolves to circle. "Give me the file," Maeve said, turning her back on the city lights and walking toward the armory. "Let's go hunting." Outside the federal building, the snow began to fall again, covering the city in a fresh layer of white. The wind howled through the concrete canyons, carrying the promise of a long, unforgiving winter. But Maeve Gallagher was not afraid of the cold. She carried the fire with her, and she would not stop burning until the entire world was bathed in the light.